There are things in life that we accept without thinking too much. A job that comes at the right time, a new client, a quick trip that seems too simple to refuse. That's how I arrived at Santa Clara Farm on a January afternoon with my car full of photographic equipment, 5 days on my calendar, and the absolute certainty that I would leave the same way I came. I wasn't counting on Rodrigo, but that comes later. First, the beginning. My name is Lucas. I'm 27 years old. I'm a freelance photographer, and back then, I spent more time in São Paulo than anywhere else, but never in the same apartment for more than 6 months. The life I had was good, functional, full of projects, and empty of roots. I liked it that way, or at least I thought I did. The job came through the recommendation of a friend who had a friend who knew the farm's owner. Dona Irene wanted to document the property before putting it up for sale. Professional photos of the land, the buildings, the landscape, the interior of the houses. Material for a high-end real estate portfolio. 5 days, accommodation on site, reasonable pay. I said yes, before even asking where it was. Santa Clara Farm was in the interior of Minas Gerais. When I typed that today, it seems simple, but back then, I had to stop the car twice in the middle of the dirt road to check if the GPS was still working right. The farm was in a valley surrounded by dense forest and cut by a river. To get there, you left the federal highway, entered a poorly maintained municipal road, turned at an iron gate, climbed about 3 kilometers of packed dirt, and then the property opened in front of you, like a green wound in the landscape. Beautiful, isolated, and in January, rainy season, humid heat that clung to your clothes and made the afternoon air shimmer. The feeling of being far from the world was physical. I arrived with my car, my camera, my bags, and expectations as low as necessary for a 5-day technical job. Photograph fences, corrals, manor houses, orchards, document for sale. There was nothing there to hold me except the deadline. Except there was. I didn't know that yet when I parked in front of the main house and got out of the car with my glasses fogged from the hot air. I didn't know when Dona Irene appeared on the porch with a warm smile and lemonade that she offered me before even greeting me by name. And I definitely didn't know when I heard heavy footsteps coming from the side of the house, when I turned and saw for the first time that man my whole life had prepared me to ignore. Rodrigo. But that's the next chapter. Let me tell you what a man like that is like. Rodrigo was 34 years old and seemed to have been born for that land. Not in the poetic way it sounds in books, actually, truly. The kind of man whose posture changes when he leaves the farm, who walks differently on dirt ground than on city pavement, who looks at the horizon and reads the weather like others read the time. Dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, with the hands of someone who's worked outdoors since childhood, and eyes a dark brown that took in everything without seeming to be looking for anything. He appeared from the side of the house with a tool in his hand. I don't remember which one, but I remember it was dirty from actual use, and stopped when he saw me. He didn't stop in surprise. He stopped the way you stop when something in your field of vision demands an evaluation before proceeding. Dona Irene was quick. "Rodrigo, this is Lucas, the photographer I told you about." She smiled, trying to break the ice. "Lucas, this is Rodrigo, the foreman here at the farm for 8 years. He knows every inch of the property. If you need access anywhere, he's the one to talk to." Rodrigo looked at me. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't say welcome. He said, "I won't be able to keep stopping work to show you around." His voice was low, more of a rasp than speech, and there was an assertion in it that didn't ask for confirmation. "Of course," I said. "I don't need a guide." He nodded, a minimal head movement, and left in the direction he'd come from. Without another word, not one. Donna Irene smiled with the maternal way of someone used to explaining the people around her. Don't mind him. Rodrigo is like that with everyone at first. Man of few words. She lowered her voice, confidentially. And lots of opinions, but he knows what he's doing. I nodded, took my lemonade, and made mentally that quick assessment we do when we meet someone new. Functional hostility. That I knew how to handle. My work didn't need sympathy, it needed access. If the foreman didn't like visiting photographers, that was fine. I'd do my job and disappear. What I didn't understand yet was why the hostility had that peculiar nature. Because it wasn't the generic coldness of someone who doesn't want interaction. It was more directed than that. Rodrigo had looked at me with excessive attention for someone who supposedly wasn't interested. The kind of look that lasts 2 seconds longer than necessary before looking away. The kind of posture that changes subtly when you approach, not withdrawal, but restraint. As if the issue wasn't ignoring me, but managing the space between us. I stored that observation where we keep things we don't want to examine, deep down, in silence. Donna Irene showed me the room that would be mine for the 5 days. A simple room in the main part of the house, with a wooden bed, cotton sheets, a window with shutters that overlooked the orchard. As we walked, she told me about the farm. Santa Clara had just over 300 hectares, cattle raising, a small artisanal cheese production that she sold to local suppliers, and the main house that she inherited from her husband, who had passed away 6 years ago. She was selling because her children lived in Belo Horizonte and São Paulo, and she preferred to be near them rather than manage a property alone. Of course, Rodrigo takes care of everything, she said, with a tone I couldn't quite place. He always has. She turned her gaze to the window, pensive. It's funny to think that he'll need to start over somewhere else. We've never really talked much about that. I didn't ask anything else, but the sentence stayed with me. That night, at the dinner table with Donna Irene and Rodrigo, I understood one thing. There was a particular grammar between the two of them. Not exactly affection, not exactly formality. It was layered respect, the kind built over years of living together when words aren't the primary means of communication. Rodrigo ate quickly, spoke little, answered what was asked in 2 or 3 word sentences, and left the table with a wave before Donna Irene finished her coffee. After he left, she looked at me with that knowing smile of someone who had seen much. He'll get used to it. Give it time. I smiled back and pretended to believe it was just that. Work starts early on a farm. I learned that on the first day, when the rooster crowed at 5:30 in the morning, with a conviction that admitted no negotiation. I got up, got dressed, grabbed my camera, and went out to photograph the dawn light on the cattle. It was the right time. That lateral golden light that lasts no more than 20 minutes and makes any terrain look like a painting. I was in the middle of the pasture when I heard Rodrigo before I saw him. Firm steps on the ground, a low whistle for the dogs that came with him, the wooden gate creaking as he opened it without looking back. He saw me. He said nothing. I raised my camera as a silent greeting and kept working. That was the pattern of the first 2 days. Rodrigo went where he needed to go. I photographed what I needed to photograph. Our paths crossed at mealtimes and occasionally on the roads between the corrals and the woods, when it was hard not to share the same stretch of road for a few meters. In those moments, the protocol was invariable. He walked faster. I pretended to be adjusting a lens, and the question of having to speak was resolved by speed. But I observed. That's what photographers do. They learn to look without seeming to look. And what I saw didn't match the simple narrative of man who doesn't want visitors. Rodrigo worked with a concentration I rarely saw in people. Not the performative concentration of someone who wants to be seen working, The silent concentration of someone who is completely immersed in what they're doing. He repaired fences with the same presence as he herded cattle to pasture, as he checked the water reservoir level, as he spoke in a low voice with the farmhands who appeared in the morning and left after lunch. He possessed a competence that needed no audience. What else there was, and I saw this more than once, from a distance, was him observing me when he thought I wasn't looking. On the afternoon of the second day, I was photographing the facade of the stone house that stood on a higher stretch of the property. A 19th century construction, thick walls, darkened wooden windows. When I noticed, through the lens reflection, that Rodrigo had stopped near the gate about 50 meters away and was looking in my direction. He stood there for about 30 seconds before turning and moving on. It wasn't the observation of someone monitoring a stranger on their property. It was different. It was, and I know this sounds like projection from someone who wants to see what they want to see, but I was a photographer. I spent my whole life reading body language. It was the gaze of someone trying to work through something that this specific presence posed. I put my camera in my bag and went to photograph something else. At night, Donna Irene tried to draw conversation between the two of us. She had a natural ability to create verbal bridges. She'd ask Rodrigo about the state of the river, ask me about my photography work, and skillfully transform both answers into something that could start a dialogue. Rodrigo answered briefly about the river. It was rising, heavy rains that week, and looked at me in a way I couldn't classify while she spoke about the importance of artistic work. Lucas also photographs places before demolitions, she said, in a way that made clear she had researched me after hiring the service. There's something of preservation in that work, isn't there? Sometimes, I said. Sometimes it's just documenting what will disappear so that someone remembers it existed. Silence. Then Rodrigo said, without looking at either of us, "The farm won't disappear. It will become another owner's." He tightened his jaw slightly. "It's different." I looked at him. He was already looking at his plate. No one said anything more about it. The third day started like the others, but ended differently. Early in the morning, I went to photograph the river's edge. It was the element I still hadn't captured properly. The farm had a natural border of about 200 meters of river that during the rainy season became wide, loud, with that red earth color that makes the water in a Minas River seem alive. I wanted the exact brightness of mid-morning, when the sun is already high enough to hit the water's surface, but still holds a golden tone before turning white. The path to the river passed through a dense forest area where the trail became narrow and waterlogged at night. I was in the middle of the descent when I misstepped on a stone covered with slime. It slipped. I held onto a branch, but the camera didn't. The leather bag hit the clay ground with a sound that made my stomach drop with it. I opened the bag with my heart in accident rhythm and found the main camera intact, the fall cushioned by the interior case. But the external flash had a crack in the mounting shoe that made it unusable. It wasn't a technical catastrophe. I could work without the flash during the day, but I needed to report the damage for insurance and check if there was any effect on the main camera that wasn't visible. I returned to the house muttering quietly. Rodrigo was on the porch with a cup of coffee when I arrived. He looked at me, looked at the bag with the visible crack on the flash, and said, "Where did it fall?" "On the way down to the river. Stone with slime." He nodded like someone confirming a long-standing suspicion. "That stone claims someone every winter." He stood up from the chair, extended his hand. "Can I see?" I handed him the bag without thinking much. He examined the flash with the practical attention of someone who understands mechanical equipment. Not necessarily electronic, but with the calm of someone who doesn't panic over material damage. He returned it. "The camera is fine. The flash is just the shoe. It can be fixed in the city, but it'll take a few days." "I know," I said. I'll be able to work without it for now." He looked at me, evaluating me for a second. Then he said, "You went to photograph the river without knowing the way." I had the map that Donna Irene gave me. "Her map doesn't have the rocks. She hasn't been there in a long time." I looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, not at me, as if the conversation were parallel to observing the landscape and not the focus in itself. "If you want to capture the river in the morning," he said, "there's a path by the orchard fence that's wider and drier. It reaches the same spot." I took a second to process that it was an offer. "Thank you." He picked up his coffee cup, drank what was left, and went back inside. But before going through the door, he turned briefly, a minimal gesture, almost imperceptible, and said, "I can take you early tomorrow, if you want." It wasn't a warm invitation. There was no warmth to it. It was functional, practical, but it was the first voluntary gesture in my direction since I had arrived. "Sure," I said. The next morning, Rodrigo appeared at my door at 6:15 with a flashlight in his hand, that sturdy metal flashlight with strong light that I would see many other times before I left, and said only, "Let's go." The path through the orchard was different from everything I had photographed until then. The forest opened into a wider passage that smelled of wet earth and ripe fruit fallen on the ground, and Rodrigo walked ahead of me at a pace that wasn't too fast for me to follow, but that also wasn't a leisurely stroll. He knew every curve of the terrain with the intimacy of someone who had built that relationship over years. At the river's edge, he stayed a little back while I set up my camera. I worked for about 40 minutes in silence. He sat on a large stone that stayed dry even when the river was full and watched the water. He wasn't watching me. He was watching the river, as if I didn't need attention, but he wanted to be near anyway. On the way back, when we were already leaving the forest, he said, almost to himself, "This river is going to rise more. There's heavy rain coming at the end of the week. A problem for the farm?" He kicked a small stone on the ground, pondering. "A problem for leaving." He looked at me sideways. "The dirt road can't take too much rain." I didn't yet understand what that meant, but I understood that the conversation had changed in tone. It was no longer the foreman reporting information to the visitor. It was something else, closer to a personal warning. The call for Donna Irene came in the morning of the 4th day, while the three of us were having coffee. I saw the change in her face before she said anything. It wasn't panic. Donna Irene was the type of woman who probably never panicked in her life. But there was a new tension in her shoulders, an attention that came over her body as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. When she hung up, she stayed for a moment looking at the cup. "My sister fell," she said. "Broke her hip. She's in the hospital in Belo Horizonte." Rodrigo said nothing, but something in his posture changed slightly, a redoubled attention, like an antenna tuning in. "I need to go," she continued, and there was in that as much resolution as sorrow. "Today, she has no one else nearby." What followed was that typical movement of when an urgent decision needs to be executed on a farm. Donna Irene gave Rodrigo instructions about the animals, the week's tasks, the veterinarian's contact in case of emergency. Rodrigo listened to everything without writing anything down. He knew that farm better than she did herself, and they both knew it. To me, she turned with the look of someone checking items off a list. "Lucas, can you continue the work without me? You already know the spaces you need to cover." "Of course," I said. "No problem. Rodrigo can help with anything you need access to." She looked at him. He confirmed with a brief nod. She looked at me. "Great." 2 hours later she had packed, organized the bare essentials, and was in the car with the engine running. Rodrigo and I stood still at the entrance to the property while she drove out along the dirt road, the car disappearing around the first bend, the dust settling, and then silence. A different kind of silence. When Donna Irene was present, there was a social buffer between me and Rodrigo, not just in the sense of a third person to fill the silences, but a more subtle function. She was the mediator, the interpreter, the one whose natural warmth created a safe context for two men who didn't know each other to coexist without having to negotiate the space directly. With her there, our interactions had a clear grammar, courtesy toward her, efficiency between us. Without her, the space became open, without mediation, without ready-made grammar. Rodrigo turned toward the farm and said, without looking at me, "Do you know what you still need to photograph?" "Yes." "There's the back barn you haven't been to yet." "I'll go there this afternoon." He agreed in silence, walked a few meters, stopped. "The sky's going to close in this weekend." He said this looking up, at the clouds that already had that dark tonality of when rain isn't just coming, but truly arriving, sooner than I thought. I looked at the same sky, heavy, low, with that oppressive weight in the air that precedes the big summer rains of Minas Gerais. "That soon?" "Maybe tonight. Definitely by tomorrow morning." He said nothing more. Went to work. I went to photograph the barn. But while I worked, his words stayed with me in a way that was more than just weather talk. There was something in the way he said it. Not a warning, not worry, but something that felt more like preparation, like he was mentally organizing what was about to happen. That evening, without Donna Irene to carry the conversation, dinner was quieter. I tried one or two openings, asked about the cattle, about the age of the buildings in the oldest part of the farm, and he answered, briefly, but he answered. There was a subtle difference in the way he looked at me now, as if Donna Irene's absence had also removed some layer of protocol he was maintaining for her, not for me. After dinner, I sat on the porch for a while. Minutes later, I heard the screen door open. Rodrigo sat in the chair beside me with a bottle of artisanal cachaça and 2 small glasses. He placed one in front of me without asking. I accepted. We stayed there until around 10 at night, drinking slowly, with the sky increasingly heavy outside and the sound of animals settling in for the night. We spoke little, but the texture of the silence had changed. It was no longer the emptiness of 2 strangers preferring not to interact. It was the silence of 2 men beginning, slowly, to grow accustomed to each other's presence. When he stood up to go to bed, he said only, "It's going to rain a lot tomorrow. Maybe you won't be able to work outside." I went to sleep thinking about it. Rodrigo hadn't exaggerated. The rain started in the middle of the night. I heard it arriving before it arrived, a distant rumor that grew until it became the sound of 1,000 things beating at the same time on the zinc roof. I woke in the dark, with rain battering the Venetian blinds and the sensation that I was inside a drum. By morning, the world had changed color. Everything that was green was darker. Everything that was earth was red. And the river, which I had photographed 2 days before in relative calm, was now rushing with a roar I could hear from the house. The entrance path to the farm was a ditch of mud. The sky didn't have a single gap. Rodrigo was in the kitchen when I came down. He looked at me with that expression of someone who had already assessed the situation and made all necessary decisions. The river rose during the night. "The exit road is impossible." He crossed his arms over his chest. "You won't be able to leave today." "Not even by car?" "Not by car." He held my gaze, serious. "Not on foot." I looked out the kitchen window. The path that led from the farm to the municipal road, those 3 kilometers of packed earth I had traveled days earlier with the car full of equipment, was now a river running parallel to the real one. Water flowed down the road as if it had always been a riverbed. "When does it stop?" "This system could last 2 days." He stood up, went to the window, looked at the sky with that reading of someone who understands the language of clouds. Maybe more. I spent the first hours of the morning photographing what I could photograph from inside the house, the interiors I hadn't yet covered, the architectural details that get put off and suddenly become the only option available. Rodrigo spent the first hours doing what farmers do when the weather doesn't permit outside work: internal repairs, inventory of supplies, checking on the animals in the covered corral. By noon, the storm escalated. What had been heavy rain became that kind of storm that makes you understand why entire generations built their beliefs around climate phenomena. The wind came along with a surge of rain that made the windows vibrate. The noise was absolute. Rain on zinc, wind in the forest, the river roaring outside with a physical presence I felt in the walls. By 2 in the afternoon, the first blackout. It wasn't gradual. The light simply went out as if someone had flipped a switch. There was the sound of the storm and the sudden darkness of a house without electricity in the middle of a cloudy afternoon. For about 3 seconds I stood motionless in the hallway, my eyes recalibrating to the little light coming through the cracks in the blinds. And then I heard Rodrigo moving at the back of the house, with the confidence of someone who knows every inch of the space even in the dark. He appeared with 2 candles and that metal lantern I already knew. He handed me one of the lit candles, as naturally as if he were handing me a cup of coffee. "The generator is outside," he said. "I'm not going to try to turn it on in the middle of this." A glance toward the window, where the rain was beating at an angle. "Later, if it lets up." "Okay," I said. And we both stood there, facing each other in the hallway, barely lit by the candle and the lantern, with the storm roaring outside, and the moment took on that strange atmosphere of when you realize the situation has shifted categories without anyone announcing it. We were no longer a visitor and a farm worker of a property that had an owner and a routine. We were 2 men alone on a property, isolated by water and wind, with 2 candles and a lantern, and night arriving sooner than expected. Rodrigo turned toward the kitchen. "I'll make food while the gas stove still works." I followed him. There was nothing more natural than that in that moment, and at the same time, there was something completely different from any moment in the 3 previous days. As he lit the stove and I sat at the table with my candle, the sound of the storm created a cocoon of sound around the kitchen that made the interior space, that small kitchen with the smell of old wood and candle smoke, strangely intimate. "Have you been trapped in a storm like this before?" I asked. He stirred a pot, with his back to me. "Every year." The sound of the wooden spoon stopped for a moment. "But usually I'm not accompanied." We ate in the kitchen with candles on the table and the storm beating against everything outside. It was at that dinner that I realized Rodrigo knew how to have a conversation. Not in the way I associated with sociable people. Not with ease, not with volume, not with the silence filling that characterizes people who are afraid of silence. He spoke like someone who guards his words because he respects them, and when he uses them with precision. He asked about São Paulo, not out of curiosity or envy, with the sobriety of someone who asks about a place radically different from theirs and wants to understand, not judge. I told him about the neighborhoods, the pace, the way of living where neighborhood exists but never intersects. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Do you like it there?" I was about to automatically answer yes, and then I stopped. The candle between us cast shadows that made our faces more revealing than daylight normally allows, and there was in his question a frankness that demanded honesty, not courtesy. "Sometimes," I finally said. "Sometimes it's the right place. Sometimes it feels like I'm in a big aquarium that everyone calls freedom." Rodrigo looked at me for a moment. "The countryside seems like a prison to anyone coming from outside." Isn't it for you? He sighed, his chest rising and falling slowly in the half-light. Sometimes. He looked toward the dark window, where the rain still beat. But the prison you know is different from the one you don't. We fell silent for a moment. The kind of silence that happens when two people have just reached a level of conversation that wasn't planned and are deciding whether to go deeper or pull back. Rodrigo stood up, picked up the lantern, and turned it on. I'm going to check on the animals in the pen. I need to see if the roof held up. Can I help with anything? He looked at me. You can come. We went out through the back door toward the covered pen, running across the part of the yard that had no roof with the rain beating at us sideways, and arrived at the pen where the cattle were calm and the roof had held up except for a leak in one corner. Rodrigo placed an old bucket under the leak with the efficiency of someone who had done it before, checked each animal with an attention I found excessive until I understood it wasn't excessive. It was real care. These animals were his responsibility, part of years of work. On the way back to the house, both of us soaked, he turned on the stove again to make coffee. I changed clothes, came back to the kitchen, and found 2 glasses waiting. The night progressed within the storm. At some point we moved from the kitchen to the covered porch, that space that was neither quite inside nor quite outside, protected by the eaves but open to the rain on the horizon. It was impossible not to keep looking at it. The forest in darkness stirring with the wind, the lightning that occasionally illuminated everything for a second and revealed the field full of water, the absolute sound of the storm that made anything else in the world impossible to imagine. It was on the porch that Rodrigo truly began to speak. Not suddenly, not with announcement. He was looking at the rain and said, as if continuing a conversation that had begun inside him before reaching me, I was going to leave here when I was young. I looked at him. He didn't look at me. To the city, he continued. I had a friend. We were raised together here in the countryside, on my father's farm. Friendship since we were 10. When we were around 18, 19, he started talking about leaving, trying life somewhere else. He gripped the edge of his coffee cup. I didn't go. Why not? The silence lasted long enough for the next lightning bolt to illuminate the field and fade before he answered. Because I kept thinking that if I went, I wouldn't be able to come back and be the person I was here. His voice came out almost in a whisper. And I needed to be that person. I stayed silent, because there were more layers in that than could fit into a quick answer. Did your friend go? I asked after a while. He did. Rodrigo picked up the coffee cup, looked at it. He never came back. He took a long sip. We lost touch. Not all at once, but it faded away. Those things that die when 2 guys stop speaking the same language. The same language. Yeah. He started living in a way I didn't understand, or that I pretended not to understand. There was something in that last sentence he left hanging in the air between us, like a fragile object that any sudden movement could break. I heard it. An outside observer. If there had been one, would have immediately understood what was being said beneath what was being said. I understood too, but I didn't move. Rodrigo kept looking at the rain. I wonder sometimes if he's doing okay. He probably is, I said. People who manage to be who they are usually do. He turned to me, quickly, as if the words had landed more directly than I intended. For a moment, I saw in his eyes something he didn't expect me to see. A question, or the answer to a question he'd never asked out loud. Then he looked away. The flashlight was on the ground between us, projecting light upward at an angle that wasn't natural, that made both our shadows longer and our faces more honest than they normally appear in daylight. He passed the flashlight from one hand to the other for a moment, without practical reason, a gesture of someone who needs something to do with their hands, because their hands want to do something else. Lucas. He said my name differently than before, not as a call, as if he were testing the weight of the name in his mouth. That friend I told you about. He swallowed hard, arranging the confession before it came out. I think I understood what he was feeling, back then. He lowered his head. Later, when it was already too late to change anything. I said nothing. Not because I didn't know what to say. I did. But because there was in that moment a silent vulnerability I recognized from the inside out. And the instinct of someone who'd been there was not to push forward with words, but to leave the space open. The rain continued. The flashlight stayed on the ground between us both, and in the darkness of the porch, with the absolute sound of the storm as the only witness to the world outside, Rodrigo said the most honest thing I'd heard from any man in a long time. I never knew how to name it. Those things you feel, but don't have words for. There are moments that don't happen because someone decided they would happen. They emerge from an accumulation of small things, a phrase that lingers in the air, a movement that goes a centimeter further than necessary, a silence that suddenly weighs more than any word could bear. You don't choose the moment. The moment chooses you, and the only real decision is whether you honor it or pretend it didn't happen. I don't know exactly how we got there. I know the flashlight was still on the ground between us, and the storm still raged outside, and at some point in the night, late, very late, when the coffee had gone cold a second time, Rodrigo had turned his body so that he was looking at me more than at the rain. And I was looking at him. There was a closeness in the space that hadn't been planned. We moved closer in conversation as we moved closer with our bodies, and the narrow porch had done the rest. I could see the texture of the fabric of his shirt in the low light of the flashlight. I could see his breathing. He looked at me for a length of time that was too long to be accidental and too short to be a statement. Then, with that slow and deliberate movement of someone crossing a line after years on the edge of it, he raised his hand and touched my face. It wasn't a quick gesture. It was the hand of a 34-year-old man who had spent his whole life learning not to do exactly this, cautious, almost shy, with his palm open against my cheek in a way that was less a kiss and more a question. A question his whole body was asking. I didn't pull back. I didn't say anything. I leaned my face into his hand, and that was enough. The kiss that came after was inevitable, but not rushed. Nothing that night was rushed. The storm had slowed time, the darkness had suspended the outside world, and there were hours of accumulated tension between us that demanded a dissolution that wasn't abrupt. It was the kiss of two men who know the gravity of what they're doing, who know that on the other side of that moment, the world will be different than it was before. Rodrigo had his eyes closed. I noticed that, because mine were open for a second, that second we sometimes steal to capture the image of a moment we know we'll need to remember. His face, without its armor, completely present. The storm raged on outside with the majestic indifference of nature to the small and absolute things that happen inside men's homes. The rain beat on the roof, the wind bent the trees, the river roared in the distance, and none of it mattered. It was I who pulled back slightly, after a time. Not in retreat in presence. I wanted to see him. Rodrigo opened his eyes slowly. He looked at me. There was an expression on his face that I couldn't name with precision, but that I recognized. The expression of someone who had just crossed a border they didn't know they were going to cross. Not regret, not relief. Something more like the vertigo of someone who has just released a burden they'd been carrying for so long that its absence feels almost frightening. We stayed like that for a while, in the dark, our hands finding each other in the space between us. There were no words for it. We tried. Rodrigo started a sentence and didn't finish it. I didn't try. There was a tacit understanding that anything we said on that porch at 3 a.m, with the storm as witness, risked being the right thing in the wrong tone, and the wrong tone was capable of breaking what was being built in real time. So we stayed silent. But it was a completely different silence from all the silences of the days before. At some point in the early morning, with the rain decreasing slightly and the damp cold of the porch becoming uncomfortable, Rodrigo said only, "Go sleep." Without coldness, without distance, with something that looked a lot like care. I did. I lay in bed with the diminished sound of rain on the roof. I looked at the ceiling for a time I couldn't measure, and I thought that it had been years since I'd felt so present anywhere. I woke with the sun. That tells me the storm had passed during the night, because January sun in Minas comes early and strong and asks no permission. The light through the blind's gap displayed that crystalline clarity of after rain, brighter, sharper, as if the storm had washed something from the air besides dust. I got up, got dressed, went to the kitchen. Rodrigo wasn't there. There was fresh coffee in the pot. He had gotten up before, made coffee, and left. I heard, outside, the sound of morning work, the gate creaking, brief voices with the hands who had returned early, the tractor that needed to check the damage in the flooded pastures. Normal sounds. Sounds of a working farm. I got the coffee, went to the porch. The morning was clean and heavy at the same time. The field was saturated, the red earth redder than any previous day. The trees with that inclination of those who'd been beaten all night. I couldn't see the river from here, but I could hear it. Still high, still with a storm voice, even without the storm. Rodrigo was in the distance of the field, checking a fence that the wind had knocked down. I saw him from afar, his back to me, his working posture, that way he had of moving through the terrain that was different from anything else. He didn't look at the house. He didn't look in my direction. I waited. I drank my coffee to the end. I went back inside, got the camera, did what I needed to do. There were still some angles of the main house I needed to cover with morning light, and the post-rain illumination was good, with a brightness different from any other day. I worked with that professional dissociation that is sometimes the best defense available. When Rodrigo came in for lunch, I was at the table with the laptop open reviewing images. He went straight to the sink, washed his hands, opened the refrigerator, started preparing food. He didn't say good morning. He didn't look at me. There was no aggressive coldness in the silence. It was a different silence, denser. The silence of someone in deliberate containment. As if each movement was being controlled with precision, so nothing that shouldn't escape would escape. I closed the laptop. Rodrigo. He continued cutting something on the cutting board. Is everything okay? His shoulders went tense. The rhythm of the cutting didn't change. It is. I knew that. I know that. It's the return to the castle when you left for a second, and the daylight reminded you the door was open. It's the defense reflex of someone who went too far and now tries to correct course. It wasn't cruelty. It was silent panic, disguised as normalcy. There was an old wound in me that recognized exactly that pattern, that knew, from inside, what it was to be on the other side of that wall when it rises back up after a night where it didn't exist. I ate lunch in silence. He ate quickly and left. The rest of the afternoon was like that. Parallel work in silence. I photographed the interior of the house. He did what needed to be done outside. When paths crossed, there was a nod. Functional, correct, distant. Like the first 2 days, but worse. Because in the first 2 days, I didn't know what was underneath the armor. Now I did. And the armor back on hurt more when you know the man inside it. At night, at the dinner table without Donna Irene, we ate with the attention of 2 men who have much to say and decided, each for their own reasons, not to say it. The sound of silverware, the sound of glasses, the night outside, clean now, with stars that the rain had revealed. Before going to sleep, I stayed on the porch for a while. That same porch, those same chairs. Rodrigo didn't come. I went to bed with that familiar anguish of when the old wound is open again. Not from new impact, but because an old echo was activated. I had promised myself, after the last time I let myself feel for someone who wasn't like that I wouldn't do that again. And here I was, with exactly that happening. And the worst part wasn't having felt. It was that I couldn't regret it. On the 5th day, I started packing equipment. It was the last planned day of my contract. I had practically all the material I needed. A few angles to complete, 1 or 2 interior areas I had skipped because of the rain. But the work was 95% done. I began filling the bags with that surgical precision photographers develop. Camera in its case, lenses organized, cables wound the right way, memory cards numbered and sorted. It was an activity that had the advantage of being completely absorbing, without requiring any real thinking. Rodrigo was somewhere on the farm. I heard him sometimes. Footsteps in the hallway, the back door, the engine of something being checked. But I didn't see him, and there was something deliberate about it. Not in the sense that he was visibly avoiding me, but in the sense that he had reorganized his own morning so that our paths wouldn't cross. I left it that way. I worked on the missing angles, the living room with the morning light that revealed the texture of the wooden floor, the hallway with the old family portraits I had put off, the back barn with the door open and light cutting through the floating dust. I worked well. The photos were good. There was in that farm the melancholic beauty of something that will be lost, not destroyed, but transformed into something else. And I had managed to capture some part of it. In the hallway, I passed by the old portraits of Donna Irene's family. There was one in particular, of a group of young people at an old farm party, decades ago, black and white. The kind of photo that tells more about people than they intended to reveal. I looked for a moment at one of the young men in the photograph, who looked at the camera with an expression that was simultaneous openness and restraint, as if he wanted something, but didn't know how to ask permission to want it. I took my photo and moved to the next space. By midday, with almost all the equipment packed, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my laptop, doing the initial upload of the images while making the decision I needed to make. Leave today, if the road was passable, or wait another day until I was sure of the route. I asked the farmhands who had returned in the morning. One of them said the road was passable for a careful car. Not great, but passable. That if I went slow and knew how to avoid the ditches, I could reach the municipal road without problem. So I had a way out. And in me, at that moment, there were 2 simultaneous and contradictory impulses that I know well. Leave before it hurts more, or stay and confront what wasn't said. The first was easier, the second was more honest. And I had spent most of my adult life practicing the first as if it were the second. I started closing the bags. At some point in the afternoon, with everything ready to leave and my car at the entrance, I was doing the final check of the memory cards when I heard the footsteps in the house that I already knew how to identify. Heavy, regular, the step of a man who knows every board of the floor he treads. Rodrigo came in through the back door, saw the bags in the hallway, stopped. He stood looking at the bags for a moment. "You're leaving today," he said. It wasn't a question. "The road is passable." He nodded. He stood still. There were between us about 3 meters of hallway and 2 days of unsaid things that suffocated more than all my equipment combined. I looked at him. He looked at the bags, and the silence had the bitter taste of a debt that will be paid one way or another. You choose the way, but it will be paid. I wasn't the one who broke the silence. Rodrigo lifted his eyes from the bags and looked at me. There was something in him different from the morning before. Not the coldness of restraint, not the distance of protocol. What was visible there was the effort of someone who is trying to decide something in real time and still hasn't decided. Then he said, "I don't know how to do this." 3 words for an entire problem. I recognized that in a way that came from deeper than the moment. From all the moments when I myself needed to say something similar and couldn't find either the path or the vocabulary. "I know," I said. "It's not that I want you to go." He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "It's that I don't know what happens if you stay. You would have to find out." He turned to the side, went to the living room window, stood with his back to me, looking out at the field that was beginning to dry. There was something almost painful in seeing him like that. That man who was all presence and solidity in the field, who had the right gesture for everything on the farm, completely ungrounded before something that wasn't in the vocabulary they taught him. "I grew up here," he said, without turning. "My father was like that. The men I knew were like that. You learn what you can be and what you can't be. And what you can't be, you bury." "Rodrigo, let me finish." He took a deep breath. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of someone working at it. "I buried it for a long time. I thought it worked. That if you don't name it, it doesn't exist." He searched for the words on the ceiling for a second. "But then, you arrived here with your camera and your way of looking at everything, as if you were trying to understand something that others don't understand. And He stopped, turned to me. I couldn't help but see. That landed on me with the brutal density of true things. "What happened that night," he continued, "was real for me. I needed you to know that. Even if I don't know what to do after." "You don't need to know everything now." "I don't even know the beginning. The beginning is knowing that it's real." I moved closer. Not too much. Not in a way that would create pressure, but enough for us to be in the same space. The rest is what comes after the beginning. Rodrigo looked at me for a while. There was something in that gaze that I can't translate with precision. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who has been truly seen, perhaps for the first time, and doesn't know exactly how to exist in that visibility. "You're going back to São Paulo?" "Yes." "Will it be different after this?" I thought about the answer that would be easy, and the one that was honest. "For me, definitely. For you." I paused. "That's a question only you can answer." He nodded, looked at the suitcases again. Then he extended his hand, not in a formal handshake, but in a way that was different. As if that hand was saying what his voice wasn't saying. I took it. We stayed like that for a moment. "I don't have the vocabulary for this," he finally said. "I never have." "You don't need vocabulary. You just said everything." He slowly released my hand, turned around, looked out at the field through the window one last time, that horizon that was the entire world he knew, and then said, very softly, almost to himself, "I don't know if I'll be able to call. You know where to find me, if you want to." He nodded slowly. "I know." I grabbed the suitcases. I left Santa Clara Farm at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday in January, with the car moving slowly down the dirt road that still held the marks of rain, and arrived in São Paulo at 11 at night, with my body tired and my mind quieter than it had been in a long time. It's been a few months since then. I'm telling this story because it's about more than what it seems when you read the title. It's not just a story about a night with a beautiful man and a dramatic storm, although it is that too. It's about what we discover when we stop protecting ourselves from what we might feel. I arrived at that farm with a shield I had been carrying for years. That agreement with myself to never feel for men who probably weren't like that. Because the last time I had done that, I left with a wound that took me too long to name. The shield worked. It kept me functional, productive, slightly empty, but functional. Rodrigo wasn't the type of man who should have destabilized me. He was exactly the type of man my shield was built to keep out. And yet he got in anyway. Not through any carelessness on my part, but because there was something in him that was too genuine to be filtered. The way he looked at that land. The way he cared for everything under his responsibility. The way he spoke about his childhood friend like someone who, without knowing it, was speaking about himself. What I brought back from Santa Clara wasn't a boyfriend. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't a pink ending. I brought back a realization. The shield I built to protect myself was also the thing that kept me from living. That self-preservation that became habit looks a lot like prison when you stop to look at it honestly. Rodrigo gave me that without knowing he was giving it. And I gave him, without knowing exactly what, but I believe I gave him, the experience of being seen without judgment, of having those things he had never named treated as valid by someone who wouldn't run from them. About him. I don't know what happened after. I know that 3 weeks after I came back, I received a message, short, unsigned, from a number I didn't have saved, but I knew who it was from. It said only, "The photos came out good," and then, "Thank you." I stared at those 2 sentences for a long time. I didn't respond right away. I stood at the window of my apartment in São Paulo, looking down at the street with the sound of the city that never stops, and I thought about the man who sent that message, about what it cost him to press send, about how for some people, "thank you" carries the weight of entire sentences they still can't say. I responded later, simply, "Me too." I don't know what comes after that. It could be a conversation that grows slowly. It could be a silence that stretches for months before anyone speaks again. It could be that Rodrigo needs a lot of time to figure out what to do with what he discovered about himself that night. Time I have no way to control, that his life will dictate at its own pace. What I know is that that night happened, that it was real, that for me, and for him, in the way he was able to say it, it mattered. Sometimes transformation doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives like a January storm on a farm in the interior of Minas, when the lights go out and you can't pretend anymore that you're not seeing what you're seeing. If you're listening to this story and you recognize something in it, the weight of the unspoken, the fear of feeling for someone who doesn't seem safe to feel for, the armor you built that became too good at the job it wasn't supposed to be doing, then you know what I'm talking about. I don't need to explain further. You know that silence. And you know, like I do, that within that silence there's something waiting to be named. If you haven't named it yet, that's okay. The storm comes at the right time. And when the lights go out, sometimes it's because what needs to be seen only reveals itself in the dark. I'm Lucas. This was my story. If it touched something in you, leave it in the comments. I read them all. And if you're not already following the Lips and Secrets channel, this is the place where these stories live. Real stories, felt stories, about what happens when we stop pretending we don't feel. Until next time.